center chooses a theme around which we try to cluster a series of events. And this year we decided to focus on media, given the important role in our life, especially after we explored the new technologies. And throughout the year we'll be trying to address a series of critical issues, ranging from issues like how do news outlet identify a human rights story, how do they frame it as a human rights story, what are some of the challenges that journalists that cover human rights stories face, how do state and non-state entities are affected by the way the media are covering human rights issues, and the list could go on and on. We have a series of 5 events in the year. We begin with our event this evening, Media Press Roundtable, and then on November 10th we're going to have a workshop on citizen journalism. Then in the spring semester we're going to have 3 events. Celebrating International Women's Day, we're going to have a panel discussion on how the media cover gender-related issues of human rights. Then in April, we hope to organize a research workshop that will bring together scholars and analysts of the media to discuss emerging issues on the agenda and kind of assess the new scholarship. And we are going to conclude with a panel on research methods. We're going to have scholars, this is going to be in May. We're going to have scholars who are going to discuss how do they collect information about human rights stories in the media, how do they assess it, and how do they measure the human rights impact. So we really hope to be able to join us for this exciting series of events throughout the academic year. This series would not have been possible but for the hard work of our terrific staff at the Center for International Human Rights, and I would like to thank my assistant Dan and all the other members of our staff for their work, as well as to welcome this year with us a former student of mine and now colleague at Shawna, Brandle, who works actually on media and human rights issues. She recently published a terrific book on this issue, and who is going to be our lead person in this effort. So I hope that you will join us for this year-long intellectual journey on media and human rights. And one last thing before I give the floor to Shawna, please make sure that you sign your name to the sign-up sheet that we have on the table so that you are included in our listserv and you can be kept abreast of all the development or activities in this series as well as other events that we have in our center. So I would like to conclude by thanking you all for being with us this evening. And now the floor goes to Shawna, who will moderate the discussion. And thank you.
Actually, I can do this right over here. Sorry. I know the optics are terrible, but my printed notes got my table plenty. So we have this panel which we would like to go sort of very conversationally. I'll give a brief introduction of the excellent people that we got to come here tonight and extend my thanks now and again at the end of the session. Thank you so much. So immediately to my left, we have Thomas Lansner, who's an experienced journalism and media educator. He's worked as a trainer and also was, for journalists, he's done election observation throughout the world, and then during the 1980s, he was a journalist throughout Africa and Asia for pretty much every outlet you could want to work for, the BBC, The Guardian, and the Far Eastern Economic Review, and that's just a couple of them. He still writes, he's up at Columbia now, that's correct? Not right now, but he's frequently at Columbia, shall we say. And he writes regularly on international affairs. To my right is Daphne Eviator. She is a lawyer and an award-winning journalist who has written widely about law, human rights, and economic development. She is a former legal correspondent for the Washington Independent, and her work has appeared on the New York Times, the Washington Post, Salon, Politico, and many others. She's also done a good deal of radio and television interviews, so we have a lot of great multi-platform journalists. Her specialties include the relationship between human rights, the law, and national security, military commissions, federal courts, and detention. To her right, this is a very power-packed panel. We have Trenton Daniel, who is an editor on the North American desk for the AP. Oh,
Yeah,
I'm late. I'm sorry.
no longer doing that.
No longer. Previously an editor for the North American desk of the AP, and he's working now on virtual reality 360-degree videos and a number of other high-tech programs which do have human rights and media implications. He's promised to talk to us about, and as well was part of the team that has previously been at the AP covering other news for them, and then also the Miami Herald, which he was part of the Pulitzer Prize finalist team for its 2010 The Earthquake Research. So we're very, very happy to have him here as well. And then finally, we have Kerry Paterson, who's a research associate for the Committee to Protect Journalism in Africa program. They work to target those people who are journalists throughout the world who are victims of violations of press freedoms in repressive countries, conflict zones, and established democracies. Her research and her work, in addition to her CPJ, looks at rape as a tool of war, and she is currently a guest blogger for WMC's Women Under Siege. So I guess I want to start out with sort of a general question to contextualize this about what is in your opinion, the biggest human rights story that you've covered, and how was it received? What was it like? So anybody can answer at any time.
I guess I'll jump in. I could begin. Oh yeah, sure. This was not. This was the January 2010 earthquake in Haiti, and so that was just this tremendous event. And as it turned out, I ended up spending 4.5 years down there, and that was just covering a range of human rights issues. And as you can imagine, there was a lot to write about, and so some of those issues ranged from a lawsuit that's filed against Jean-Claude Duvalier, the former dictator who returned in 2011. It also involved a suit that had been filed against the UN for introducing cholera in the aftermath of the earthquake. It also involved, sometimes violent land disputes. Just a range of issues. And also trying to figure out how to provide housing for people who have been displaced. So it was,
And when do you remember using explicitly a human rights frame for it, or was it more implicit, or?
I would say it was a little bit of both, in the sense that, it was like trying to, there were a number of people displaced. It came down to there were 1.5 million people who were displaced. Often terms would get thrown around that these were refugees when actually they weren't, because they weren't crossing borders, and they were, IDPs. Although for newspapers and wires, we can't really use the word IDPs because it'll ostensibly turn off readers. So it's just like trying to figure out the right language to use and nuance. And so there was that, and I think there was an interest in human rights that was just informing much of the coverage, trying to figure out what sort of laws apply to people who've been displaced, and then what sort of rights are available to them. And I think that was driving much of the coverage.
I guess in terms of human rights stories, it would be more in the last few years, the last 5 years or so, I've focused a lot on U.S. practices of indefinite detention without trial, so specifically at Guantanamo Bay and at Bagram in Afghanistan. And I think the story that grabbed me most was the Bagram story, because they were a lot further away, a lot more hidden. They had absolutely no rights. There was no due process hearings at all, and thousands of people who were there held by the U.S. government without any charges, any evidence brought against them, nothing for years. And so that really grabbed me. And that was, I've been working for Human Rights First for the last 5 years, so we really do frame that as a human rights story. And I really tried to frame that under human rights law and to say that it was a violation of international human rights law. The U.S. government didn't agree, but we still make the argument. It has to do with the question of how you interpret the law. But I think the question of, it's interesting because what we think of as human rights, I think generally in the public is probably a lot broader than what's kind of technically human rights under the law. And so we try to frame them under the law if we think there's an argument to be made that could be persuasive to someone, but it also can narrow things a lot because there are things that we would probably want to consider general basic human rights to housing, water, and things like that the U.S. government at least doesn't recognize as an actual legal right. So, but that was the story that we definitely framed, I definitely framed as rights, and continue with the Guantanamo story that frame as a right.
I mean, I think, forgive me if this is a little bit of a cop-out answer, but most of my job is to protect people who are telling these stories rather than to tell them myself. I think one of the, so to answer the question differently, one of the more interesting, or I guess one of the biggest cases that we've worked on in terms of someone who was exposing a human rights violation or exposing human rights violations in the world, was a group that we started working with last year called Raqqa is being slaughtered silently. It's a group of citizen journalists and bloggers who are based in and outside of now Raqqa in Syria. Essentially, after the rest of the press and world had left that part of Syria, they continued to use their cell phones to basically upload any photos, any recordings, anything that they could document about what was happening in the city. It quickly got, so I mean, every person affiliated with them is being hunted by ISIS. Every person involved in that process, whether it was helping them design a logo or getting their website set up or managing their social media, we've done a lot of work, whether it's helping them relocate or providing them with support to get out when they needed to. For the most part, they're now based in different parts of Europe, but a lot of what we were doing was trying to help support this group of people who are, the same age as many of the students who go to school here. We're talking about I think the oldest one at that point was 25 years old. You have a group of kids who at this point, they were having family members murdered. They were having, one of them had his brother murdered, pretty quickly after we announced that we would be giving them an award to recognize the work they were doing for press freedom and to sort of expose these violations. And what was particularly striking is that these, they're literally taking the greatest possible risk. They're putting themselves, quite literally, their lives on the line to expose the human rights violations happening in Raqqa, and in a way and at a scale that I think is really hard to grasp for most people. So in terms of, it wasn't the story that I covered, but certainly they're framing it in terms of the human rights violations that are taking place in Raqqa and sort of contextualizing that both within the rest of Syria and within sort of a global conversation about, where and when and how we ought to consider interventions or not and what that looks like.
Thanks. Human rights violations are perceived differently in different places, and as you mentioned, Shawna, I wrote a lot for British media, and one of the reasons was when I was writing, especially this is in the 80s into the 90s, American media wasn't all that interested in human rights violations, and they didn't like the framing of reporting on insurgencies or other things as human rights issues. And I found the British media much more amenable, the Guardian in particular, the Observer, to writing about human rights violations and issues of torture and abuse as in a political context, that this was causing problems and not that the human rights violations were caused by political situations which were leading to human rights violations. So when I was first reported from the Philippines, I wrote a piece. I was freelancing, so I tried to sell it to different newspapers, and the story was that military abuses are fanning the rebellion. American papers wanted no part of it because it was obviously the communists who were fanning the rebellion, not military abuses. Largest stories in scale, maybe Uganda, was there early on, and again, American media had very little interest in what was going on. This was post-Idi Amin, so the clown dictator was gone. There wasn't much interest there. The British media had much more interest because there was still the colonial linkages and things like that, so they would report on things. And they also accept reporting in a way that was reporting about the abuses as a driver of the political situation, which American media, especially in those days, wasn't very interested in, because they weren't very interested in Africa, basically, and then in the Philippines, where it was, because the dominant narrative was about the communists trying to take over the country. The communists were evil, so we had to support the authoritarian government of Ferdinand Marcos until the very last second. So the reactions were often based on the narrative of the country to which I was writing, rather than just necessarily the situation on the ground. A story that got perhaps the most play, I went to Eritrea during the war and interviewed prisoners of war. And there were kids there, 13, 14 years old. And I had some interesting photographs, and you could see they were children. So once children are involved in any human rights reporting, well, that's, I think it was Susan Miller about the hierarchy of innocence. And children are the most innocent of all. So if you can report on children as victims of human rights, survivors of human rights violations, it will certainly get more attention than any other victim or survivor. And so this was a story that got the most attention. Perhaps that was it. I'm not sure really the impact it had. There was a little bit of movement. The ICRC noticed to get those kids out, but the war ended within a year or two, so it resolved itself.
So this is already so much to talk about in terms of the context, and it sort of leads me to my question about what training you received about definitions of human rights. Because in my own research, I've seen exactly what you said, that people are referred to as refugees and they haven't crossed an international border, and the sort of the international law scholar in me screams at the television. And then to hear it from the journalist perspective, you could talk about, can you even write that? I haven't seen it written by anyone, or many people, especially not in TV print.
Right, what exactly?
Right, IDPs or internally displaced persons, or what about the language and the constraints?
I even see that error, and at work, and it's just, I think it's just, a lot of people who just don't quite understand the distinction, and probably understand the legal complications for that, and I think it just requires a bit of pushback, and then just trying to figure out what is a term, or it's just like the most appropriate term that can still be accessible, if you will. As a journalist, I'm writing for a lay audience, and so, it's imperative to just make sure that these stories are readable and just educate people as opposed to, of course, taking a cause.
That's really interesting. And then Daphne, when you talk about legal framework, right, or legal framework. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm not used to having to actually be loud. It usually comes naturally. So in talking about the legal framework, because you said you frame things with a specific target in mind, the U.S. government framework, is that part of your journalistic practice or your legal training, or?
Well, that's the role that I have now is as a lawyer. So my writing is really advocacy writing, and I write reports on human rights issues, but it's in the context of advocacy for a human rights organization. And I used to be a journalist before I joined Human Rights First, and at that point, so I write about things differently now than I would in the past. But I think actually human rights organizations and lawyers need to do a much better job of explaining, of writing in a way that people can understand. So I learned a lot about international human rights law just on the job, Human Rights First, from great international human rights lawyers, and I've learned a ton about it, and that's nice for advocacy that you're going to do in Washington. But if you're trying to explain something to the general public, you need to make really clear what you're talking about. And I think one problem I see a lot now, like I also write for a legal blog called Just Human Rights Issues, and it's not comprehensible to the vast majority of people who aren't also legal academics, actually not even lawyers, but and I think there's a real resistance on the part of people who are kind of steeped in these issues, whether they're human rights practitioners or lawyers or academics, to making what they're talking about accessible to other people. And I think there's a real divide that I think needs to be bridged.
And in terms of the training sort of that you had, was it part of in journalism school, or you're coming up as a journalist? Is human rights part of the framework or part of the training or education process? Was that, I mean, I want to start with Tom because he
Okay, I didn't attend journalism school, and I did not have formal human rights training. So I'd have to answer no. I was interested in human rights for whatever my own reasons that were found out when I was an undergraduate. So I knew about it a bit, and I would speak to human rights people as part of the going out to meet all sorts of people when you're in the field. Human rights workers or people who sometimes have the best interests information on the ground. So to me, it was absolutely natural that I would be seeking them out and trying to find out what they had to say. And they were an immensely good source of information. And I checked in with people like Amnesty International and Lawyers Committee for Human Rights many years ago. The Human Rights First, before predecessor, the same organization, before it changed names. And they had information that would be very hard for me to get. And they also had resources beyond what a journalist might have in terms of being exceedingly careful and closely analyzing information for the longer term. As a journalist, I was working for daily and weekly newspapers, and I was also spraying for the AP in a few places over time. Sometimes you have to report things by the hour, and you did not have time to analyze and research, make sure you try to be right rather than just be first. But you did not have time to look at everything as closely as you might want to. I'll give a brief example of the difference between the journalist and organization work. I was in Sri Lanka. I interviewed people who had witnessed a massacre in Shawna. And I was there, I got photographs, I had a tape recorder on with an interpreter because I didn't speak to them. And someone would say something through 2 or 3 sentences, and my interpreter would say about 4 words. I knew there was more there. But I got enough that I could triangulate a little more, and I was pretty convinced that people had died of bloodstains and bullet holes and shell casings and interviewed family members. But when I went back to London, I took the cassette tape into Amnesty, which when I'd done some work in Africa, back and forth. And they said, they asked me, they said, do you have a tape? I said, sure, you can have it. So I gave it to them and some of the other photographs. And they got 2 independent Tamil speakers to transcribe the tape, about 35 minutes of tape. And they said, well, and when I spoke to them later, I said, well, how was it? They said, well, what you had was pretty close. And they sent this sort of shiver down my journalist's spine and say, well, was anything more? No, it wasn't more. It was just a lot more. So as a human rights organization, they had 2 independent translators transcribe it. And then they were able to put it in a report in a way that was unimpeachable. Whereas my next day journalism might have been a bit impeachable, but I wasn't, I was convinced I had enough and was right enough to be able to report that. But the human rights groups go much further and have to maintain their own integrity and their own position as being hopefully unimpeachable sources of information compared to just as I was in mere journalists.
Now, I didn't know this, but not only are both Trenton and Daphne graduates of the Columbia School of Journalism, they were in the same class. So if I can ask you, was human rights training or human rights, any of that part of the training at Columbia when you were there? Or is it more of the on-the-job sort of observing and seeking it out yourself?
I don't recall any human rights training at Trenton. I mean, I learned it on the job, definitely. And I went to law school before that, and I didn't study it in law school either, so I definitely learned it on the job. But I don't remember that, do you?
Not overtly. I mean, there were some courses on just covering international topics, and it was just like trying to figure out the logistics of getting from A to B and then trying to figure out budget. But it was just really, really out of touch with just the real experience was like. I mean, obviously I learned much more from just being on the ground, and as Tom said, just developing relationships and contacts with attorneys and human rights activists. And I think one thing that was critical in that was essentially just sharing information and just saying, hey, look, this is what we've seen with our eyes, and then please let me know if you hear anything else. And I think that like those relationships are really important because like both people are getting something out of this, and it's just not the reporter just calling someone, it's just saying, hey, do you have anything new?
So a symbiotic relationship between journalists and NGOs or activists.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and yeah, because it's obviously mutually useful.
Well, it's really, I want to, before we sort of bag too much or be critical of journalism school, when you say you had to learn it on the job, do you think that classes are including this in any type of curriculum would have been useful, or is it really the type of thing that you've got so much else to learn in that framework?
I mean, you mentioned that you went to law school. I mean, I think that to have that kind of background would be incredibly useful. Just to have that knowledge and be armed with that, and then be able to just know all these legal matters. Just have it at your fingertips. I mean, I think that would be huge asset.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, your journalism school is a relatively short program, and people do, go in there wanting to do international human rights reporting or entertainment reporting or local courts reporting, or, you know what I mean? Like, it's such a range of journalism covers that I don't know that it would make sense to teach human rights specifically in journalism school. And like I said, I didn't even study it in law school. I mean, there's some advantage to like having a legal background. You kind of know how to read laws. But I really learned the most from legal experts. And actually, I ended up at Human Rights First because I used to call their international legal counsel, who's a great guy, at Rona. He teaches at Cardozo now. And we just became friendly, and then they were looking for someone, and he asked me to apply, and like that's how I ended up here. I wasn't even looking to switch, to go back into doing legal work, but people like that who are willing to sit down and explain to you, okay, this is what you're talking about, this is the legal framework, this is what you need to know. It's totally in their interest because they want people to understand, and lawyers get really frustrated when they read journalist stories that they think are wrong, and they kind of, I think, exaggerate the importance sometimes of it, but they want to explain to people, this is what a human rights law is, and this is a violation of the law, and this isn't, and so they're eager for that, and it's enormously helpful to journalists to talk to those people. So in a way, you have such a privilege as a journalist, you get to call these amazing experts who know so much and just pick their brains and learn from them. And I kind of think that's the best way to learn this stuff.
So in the conversations that we've had so far, correct me if I'm wrong, but we've talked about cases in Asia and Africa and the Caribbean, and we haven't talked about anything in the domestic U.S. So do we cover, is it a valid, when journalists look at an issue, is human rights a valid frame for stories, domestic stories? Are there, because I think we can stipulate that there probably are human rights violations that happen in the United States domestically, but we don't see, so is it a valid frame, or are those things getting covered in different ways, do you think, or is it not, why is it not covered that way, or is it covered that way? I'm misinformed, or is it wasn't? What do you think that one?
Yeah, human rights violations in the United States are covered, certainly covered, but mostly outside the United States.
That's a good point.
Our narrative in the United States is that the dominant narrative in the United States is that we're the shining city on the hill, and that if there are human rights violations, there are accidents, occasionally mistakes. People can understand the difference between accidents and mistakes, which, well, journalists can't get that either. But we don't frame it that way, and we certainly don't frame. We haven't really touched on this, but most reporting on human rights is about civil and political rights. And American media especially, American society understands almost all human rights in terms of civil and political rights. American media loves to cover elections, even here in the United States. But reporting on human rights violations in the United States, even the ones that, if you're looking from outside, and I spent about 10 years living outside the United States again, and looking from afar, looking at police killings, looking at police violence, it's framed here, becoming more of a frame here that there's clear human rights violations. But outside the United States, you see it as glaringly obvious. And everybody sees it as glaringly obvious in that way. And there is more coverage in some places outside the United States of next generation rights, of environmental rights, of environmental human rights, especially among marginalized communities in the United States. Now, there is that kind of coverage in the United States. And something when we talk about the media, I try not to talk about the media. There is no the media. When we say the media, we're thinking it look like a huge, dark, monolithic building that says media on it. There is dominant media, and there is media that most people rely on, or different sections, but there is coverage out there of those things, but you have to be very selective. You have to be almost entrepreneurial to find those things. So it's not that it's not out there, but it's drowned out by other voices. So indeed, there are plenty of human rights violations to be covered in the United States, and with the human rights frame, civil, political, but also economic, cultural, social rights that have been violated day in, day out, and been violated since the first people from far away came by boat and land on these shores.
If I can just jump in, I mean, it's an interesting point, and I think the law probably has had some influence on the way it's covered in the U.S. because the United States has ratified the international treaty that covers civil and political rights, but it has not ratified the treaty that covers economic and social rights. So it's not going to be framed, if you go call that legal expert on human rights and say, is this a human rights violation? They might say, well, no, because at least in the United States, we don't recognize have right to housing or right to clean water or things like that, whereas other countries do. Europe has a very different perspective, for example, on human rights. They take a much broader perspective. They take human rights law, international human rights law, much more seriously than Americans do. And that's kind of a cultural difference and a difference of experience, and of them having experienced world wars directly in a way that we didn't. And so I think partly the law has influenced how the media talks about these things. And so we could talk about police violence or racial conflict, but it won't be characterized as a human rights violation. Yeah, and that's why I think it's an interesting distinction that, but we've allowed what the United States government has decided the law is for itself to define in many ways how the U.S. media covers this issue.
Should the journalism, media, fight against this idea?
Well, it's interesting because in a way, the role of the journalist isn't to define the violation, is to tell the story, right? Is to tell the story of this person, this happened, and this person was beaten to death by a police officer, or this person, this community's water was destroyed by this corporation. It's not to put necessarily a label on, and I think that's why it's not necessarily called human rights, because legally then you have the lawyers saying, well, that's not really legally a violation. So that's why I think when you talk about human rights, has this connection to the law, both domestic and international, and that's why I think journalists will shy away from using those labels if it's not legally considered that.
Do you think it's the law that makes it, because like you said, you tell a story and there's lots of different, so you have your sort of whatever the story is, but there's different ways to tell that story, there's different ways to frame it. Do you think it's the law that drives the frame selection? Or do you think it's more sort of audience driven, that it's not? There are other ways to tell those stories that would be more appealing to the audience.
You know, it's hard for me to say. Like, as a lawyer, I kind of tend to think, like, I don't want to call something a right if there isn't a legal right to it, because I think it's misleading. I think it's confusing. I would rather just describe the problem and let the society decide how it should be solved, as opposed to saying this person's right to water is violated. I absolutely believe we should have a right to clean water, but I don't think I would, as a journalist, want to use that. Even as an advocate, I wouldn't want to use that term, because I think it's misleading and not everyone agrees it's a right. So let's stick with what we agree with, which is this community's water has been completely contaminated, and now they have to buy bottled water and plastic to survive. You know, that somehow to me that's more meaningful than casting it as a right.
I agree completely with you, but I know from yours and Spain that if I understood Thomas correctly, I had the impression that you not only don't put the label, but don't put the story.
That's a different question, right?
It's a different question.
Yeah.
So what stories are selected to be told, as well as how they get told?
And if I could just say one more thing, and then I'll stop talking about this. I mean, it raises a fascinating issue too, which is that I think domestic media, and again, obviously not all media, but a lot of media, mainstream media, don't tend to think about, well, what might be the European perspective on this, or how does the rest of the world look at this? Like, so we'll cite, the American legal experts or experts on whatever, but we won't say, like, and by the way, this is considered a human rights violation in the UK, or, we won't step back and give that global perspective, I think. And that's another area where it's missing, that there's sort of a given that the U.S. interpretation of international law, or what the U.S. has decided to accept in the law, is correct. And there isn't a lot of perspective, a lot of stepping back and taking a perspective on how other people are viewing this, or how people in other countries are viewing it.
I think just to kind of piggyback on that, I think one of the things we see, I only moved to the U.S. 2 years ago, and one of the things that was really interesting is the way, growing up in Canada, the way that America and human rights violations here are portrayed in the media. My parents were much more concerned with my safety moving to New York City than they were when I moved to Sweden. So, and that sounds like a joke, but I think, like, realistically, what you start seeing is that it's not just, yes, there's a component of it that is what sort of angle of the story gets told, certainly. And if you are telling the story of a 12-year-old girl who's been gang raped, and that story starts by you saying that she's 12 and she's wearing 6-inch heels and a mini skirt and lipstick and where was her mother, it's a very different story than a story that says this horrific thing happened and where were the police and not responding to calls, right? And you're still telling facts about the same story, but you're naturally framing that story a certain way. There's a different piece that comes through based on what parts of the story you choose to emphasize or tell, the questions you decide to ask, the people you decide to consult. And so I think, to the point that Daphne was making earlier about sort of the culture around this in Europe and in other places, to some degree you are, the journalist's job is very, like, I'm a human rights advocate. If you look at my bio, that's all I've ever done. I'm the child of 2 human rights lawyers. That's, it's in my blood. But, the job of the journalist isn't to tell you what to think. The job of the journalist is to tell the story and present you with the facts. And that's a very different thing. Now, that's not to say that every sort of side of the story gets treated equally, but I do think that then what you're sort of looking at is saying, how can they bring about a discourse or a discussion about human rights or about human rights violations without kind of either mischaracterizing what actually it is that we're talking about. So something being a legal definition or not, or something being, there's a difference between when you are writing a letter or presenting testimony to Congress or doing something where the legal definitions are sort of the most salient part of what you're doing, and when you're trying to sway public action or discourse around something. So Disneyland with healthcare, but the reality is that Canada is well over 800 missing or murdered Aboriginal women. We've been condemned internationally for this. I believe we were put on a list alongside Iran and Saudi Arabia for our treatment of Indigenous women. It's appalling. And writing a story about the legal basis about whether or not this constitutes genocide or cultural genocide, or whether we accept that term or what that means, is not going to sway public opinion. What did sway public opinion was a huge journalistic expose about a volunteer task force that's fishing women's bodies out of a river, and that they didn't tell that story with the goal of achieving a certain end in terms of like striking down this legislation or introducing that sort of legal response, but rather to find a way to say this is a story that matters and this story fits in a context of abuse, and that's something that needs to be discussed, right? So, I think a lot of it speaks to, who is the audience you're writing for? What is the point of what you're doing? A report written by Human Rights First or, even by CPJ, is not the same thing as an article that is meant to sort of inform the general public. And that's not to say that we shouldn't all strive to use inclusive or accessible language. We absolutely should. But it's also about knowing what you're trying to achieve with what you're doing. What is the piece of writing or the piece of journalism or the report that you're putting together and trying to achieve, and who's reading it?
Yeah. Can I ask Daphne another little bit trickier question I can understand? For example, if you discuss the feed water crisis, that you don't bring international common economic social rights issue. But what about the death penalty in the United States, which come under the international covenant on civil and political rights? Okay, the U.S. has attached a reservation. Some people have asked, raised question whether this is consistent with long-term terms of the treaty. But what I find fascinating, there is an international legal obligation. The United States has enforced the Human Rights Committee. The Human Rights Committee has criticized the United States for its discriminatory treatment. There have been visits by the Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Arbitrary Detention to look at the death penalty situation in the United States, which was kind of like aliens landing on American soil. But none of these figures are in the American press. It is only particularly in the domestic context. My question is, if an argument can be made, it will not resonate with the American public if you discuss the free water crisis in the context of the covenant on economic, social, and cultural rights. Shouldn't an effort be made to make sure that the death penalty is put in the context also of the U.S.'s obligations under the international covenant on civil and political rights, and remind that the trend within international human rights law is to push towards the abolition of death penalty?
Yeah, I guess it depends, again, what role you're playing, right? So there's a whole movement now among human rights advocates to try and emphasize the application of international human rights domestically in the United States. And so they will talk about that issue. And people who are focused on the death penalty will talk about the fact that it's a violation, it's considered, except for in the United States, it's broadly considered a violation of international civil and political rights. As a journalist, so I guess it depends on who your audience is and what you're doing. If you're telling a story about a person who's on death row, whether it violates, whether their execution would violate international law as interpreted by another country might seem sort of tangential to the story of this individual human being. But there is absolutely a movement among people who are advocates on these issues to try to get that more in the discourse. There's a whole network of people who are very actively trying to do that and trying to bring those issues to the United States and to the government and raise it with media. I just think it's a harder sell for the media.
Yeah, and just to follow very quickly, as far as the media is concerned, where would you attribute the main reason for resistance to moving in that direction to cover such stories, part at least of the established media? Why there is more of a resistance to bringing international human rights discussion to the death penalty?
you know, again, I feel like I can't speak for media generally, and I've written for different kinds of media, but I think in general, you know, we find the same thing with advocacy. People, the American public in general, doesn't seem to have much regard, at least the general wisdom is that they don't have much regard for international law. International law is kind of portrayed as sort of an interference with U.S. law, like the U.S. likes to think it's sort of above all of that. The U.S. government portrays itself as a bit above all of that. So I think culturally there's a tendency to say, like, international law, if it's not something that the U.S. agrees to, then it doesn't really matter. It doesn't apply. And so I just think it's something that's taken much more seriously outside the United States than it is inside the United States, in part because it's not enforceable against the United States, right? Like, there is no human rights court that's going to enforce any sort of decision against the United States government. So then it becomes that much less relevant in journalism because, I mean, I remember writing about international human rights law when I was a journalist and asking, well, does this matter? Like, yes, so we've just violated the law, but does it matter? And no one could explain to me why it mattered because no one was going to be able to enforce it against the United States. So it's interesting as sort of a principle, but in terms of like the facts on the ground, it tends to not matter so much.
I sort of would like to, because we have represented here people who have written at different times and for different outlets. So I want to ask whether or not there are any trends over time or trends across platforms or major differences you've noticed in different platforms in trying to cover human rights, either with an explicitly human rights frame or a human rights story without that explicit frame.
I mean, I think what we're seeing now with the use of cell phone, mobile phones is certainly changing the dynamics. I mean, I think the Black Lives Matter is certainly, uses this new type of media now, and I think that it's much easier to document police shootings. And I mean, like, one can make the argument, well, are there more police shootings now, or is it just the proliferation of? It's just so much easier to just film these acts as they're happening. And I think, that's obvious. That's a huge change.
Now someone is telling the story.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there used to be no CCTV in the forest and the tree fell, right? And now there is, so we know the trees are called in the forest. And there are huge differences also in, I think, the knowledge of journalists from 20, 30, 40 years ago. And that awareness really came up during the Balkans War, after the Balkans War, during and after, when people went out and didn't know what they were seeing things happen. They didn't know whether they were humanitarian law violations. And there was a book that came out after that David Reef and Roy Cutman put together some of the crimes of war, which is a very useful hands-on anthology of what violation crimes of war are. And it's then we've heard more journalists, I saw some report, certainly the BBC correspondent, I think it was Lisa, who said saying, and if it was the Syrian government, this is certainly a war crime that we've just witnessed, which you would not have heard ever a journalist saying, perhaps even 20 years ago. So there's much more awareness, and much more awareness possible for journalists, even if it's not being taught in J schools. And just as a side, I taught many years at CPAP, and actually I went over to the J school years ago and tried to pitch a course on how international stories were covered, and what the narrative was, perspectives, and the difference between American perspectives and international. But they basically kicked me out. It was a good old crusty hack sitting with here and swore at me and said, we teach our people to report, we don't need that kind of stuff. And it's true, okay, it's a short course and a lot of different kinds of things we get to work and get out and learn to write. Sometimes it'll be, etc. But one other point is that I really have to argue with you that journalists go just out there and present the facts now. I mean, that's sort of the RW1 approach. But you go out there as a journalist and you write something and you're selecting facts, you're selecting usually you're selecting the frame, selecting which quote to put first. You're selecting who to give credibility to a reliable source, unreliable source. And of course, that's going to affect everything you do. And you're presenting a case. And when I would write something and people would walk away and say, "Wow, that's how it really is," I'd say, "Yeah, that's right. That's how it really is according to me." You can deconstruct all the journals and do context analyses and look at it, and you're going to find every sort of bias, if not bias, every selection of facts, selection of scenes, selection of frames, which have been used, and almost every story could have been written in a very, very different way.
Yeah, I entirely agree with that. I guess perhaps a better way to frame what I was getting at was that, my beat, as it were, in my job, I run global advocacy as senior advocacy officer at CBJ, and my job is to find the press freedom angle in that story and advocate for press freedom. And so I, as a human being, a lot of my background is in women's rights and women's rights in conflict and sort of experiences in wartime. But ultimately, my obligation is to focus on and to highlight issues of press freedom, threats to journalist safety, and specifically, sort of unpack that, which is to say there might be a really compelling narrative here about, or a really important story about, Syrian refugees if we're caught in this situation. But in my capacity in this role, my only job is to focus on that, and that is the frame with which I'm approaching everything. I guess what I was sort of getting at is not that I think that journalism exists without bias, because again, I do live in America now. I watched last night's debate coverage pretty extensively, but I do think, yeah, it's true. But I guess I think there is a little bit more space. You come back and bring those things back, and ideally you're interacting, with an editor who sort of says, hey, maybe talk to someone with a different point of view, or And so I do think, I guess what I'm driving at wasn't that I think it's unbiased, but that you have a different kind of obligation in terms of what you're trying to achieve with what you write. I'm not seeking to just inform, I'm seeking to convince with everything that I do. And I don't necessarily think that that's inherently true with everything you do as a journalist, whether or not that's your goal. Like that may be the end result, whether or not you're trying to, but it's different than that.
The experience here is in American media, other media systems having different interpretation or application of journalistic norms too. So, picking aside, like you said, British news is a little bit more comfortable with the role of the journalist as advocate in selecting more and being more explicit about that as well, whereas it may happen in American media.
And a big part of what I sort of come across in my work is trying to figure out who actually counts as a journalist. It's not just somebody who went to journalism school. It's not just somebody who's writing for the New York Times or the Guardian. We had a journalist who, one of the case that we worked on, a journalist who was killed in 2015 I believe it was the DRC. This journalist was, waking up in the morning and going to a neighboring community and looking up what was going on in the news on the internet, and then coming back and reporting it on a local radio station. And when the local radio transmitter broke, he did the same thing, but he would come back and walk through the typical town square with a megaphone announcing the news to his community. That man's a journalist. It's not what I would think of when I think of, a journalist who lives or works in New York, or a journalist covering, the state dinner in Washington. But that person is, investigating, finding out the facts, sharing that information with the public, adding, his sort of sense of what is important to that. And that journalist was ultimately killed for his work. He announced something that, upset a community member and, was physically attacked and murdered. I think that, overwhelmingly the journalists who come under attack are, upwards of 80% of our local press. They're, it's by and large, it's not sort of the Jim Foley's or the Stephen Sotloffs or these sort of Western journalists who go off and get killed elsewhere. Overwhelmingly, we're talking about Syrian reporters in Syria, Congolese reporters in Congo, and Mexican reporters trying to tell stories about what's going on with cartels and finding themselves, sort of under great threat. And that comes from trying to tell those stories often in a context or in a way where those stories can't always be told, or the consequence of the telling those stories, is quite great. But I do think part of that conversation when we say, how does this get covered, how does this get framed, is also who gets to cover them, right? Because the same tools that these journalists are using, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or any of these sort of online platforms, are also now being used by the people who attack them. 40% of the journalists who were killed last year were killed by Islamic militants, Islamist militant groups. And those are groups that also very much made use of the same platforms to share information about those killings, to flaunt the impact of those things. And I think that really, it does change the way you have to think about the tools you use to do your job.
I think we had a question in the back.
Oh, I had one when you were talking about people in the media having or journalists having more access to information due to the increasing use of social media and phones and all that stuff. So all I just want to ask is, when right now there's an event, there's something that I'm always watching in Instagram, Facebook, YouTube and stuff like that going on with. I think the hashtag is NoDAPL, so no to the, how do you call it? The pipeline. And I don't see no coverage of it in, how you call it, in the media, or in the mainstream media. And it's for me, from what I'm saying, it's more difficult to find it if it's not in social media. And all I want to ask is, for events like that, not only in that kind of event, but in other events that have been going on in this country and stuff, do the journal are the journalists part of, let's say, the responsibility, and should they be held accountable if they choose to not, let's say, shine a light to stop to, let's say, wrongdoings going on in this country or anywhere else?
Okay, there's a lot there.
Oh,
No, it was great. It was 4 or 5 great questions or points to raise.
One of the things, the pipeline and the protests have been covered mostly by alternative media. And one of the things that got a little bit of attention, I don't know if CPJ did any things about this, I think he did when a woman who works for the outlet called Democracy Now! Was charged with riot for reporting and other journals. So that got some attention, because there's nothing more that the media likes to report on than about itself. So that could be a good way to get some media attention, get a journalist arrested. Hopefully not anything.
Please don't.
Hopefully not anything worse than that. So indeed, that has gotten much less attention than I would have thought would be worthy in America's mainstream media. There are a lot of other distractions right now. When election season, that's an explanation, an excuse. Acts of commission not covering something well. How do you hold journalists accountable? There is no accountability for journalists in the United States. And that's something that perhaps we should be very happy about in a lot of ways, that if we start demanding accountability for journalists, I know it would be fine if it was we two making the decisions, because we'd be quite reasonable about it. But I don't know if I'd want anybody else making those decisions. And it's something that's, I think, very basic, that there are no qualifications as such in the United States to be a journalist. No qualifications beyond, hopefully, reporting honestly, accurately as possible. You don't need a J school degree. You don't need to have gone to elementary school if you're a good writer. In other countries, there are places that have imposed requirements: university degrees, journalism degrees, certificates, licenses,
union membership,
which can be tools to control media rather than to improve the quality of media.
And also, I was hoping we could impose on you. Great question. I think we'll talk a little bit more about that, about the new technology that you're working on and how it may relate to human rights in media as well.
Yeah. So what I would say, we at VP and other news organizations, you'll probably notice we're just experimenting a lot with new technologies. In this case, we're using virtual reality or 360 video, and that's as a way to tell stories. And so there, in light of our coverage, when we will certainly be covering human rights issues to some extent, but we're still very much just trying to figure out the rules, the standards, and the ethics. And for example, I went out to Cleveland and Philadelphia, where the RNC and the DNC, with the camera that Google had provided, and so I have this rig with multiple flashing lights that looks very much like the Space Needle in Seattle, and it's just filming everyone around. And like typically, you can see a journalist, he or she shows up with a camera, has a microphone, starts asking questions. In this context, it's just the camera, it's just shooting, so raising a question of, is this surveillance or journalism? And it's, you know, in this, I'm not asking people, can I interview you? Or can I film you? I mean, I'm asking people, can I interview you? And this device, of course, is just alien to them. In Cleveland, there was police everywhere, and this device was certainly making a few of those officers nervous. I was being filmed as I was setting it up, and it's just capturing everything around it. So, yeah. So I guess I'll just leave it. We're just still very much just trying to figure out, like, how can we use this for coverage. The other thing I'll say is there have been arguments made about how 360 video can be used for telling human rights stories and increasing empathy. That's something I hear quite a bit. But, you know, I'm not sure if that's the case. AP did a piece with Riot on this migrant camp in southern France. There are about a few thousand refugees in there. It was just a brief piece, and it's useful in the sense that it can show people what a refugee camp looks like. And in a way that is just not visible through other media, I believe. Yeah, and there are just a bunch of media.
Interesting. There's something else.
Can I just jump in on that? Because I was thinking about this before I came, like, about some of the challenges. And I mean, first I would just add to what you're talking about is drone technology also, you know, has the opportunity to do a lot of really interesting things. Again, you don't get any permission, no one's signing any releases, no one knows that they're necessarily being filmed by a drone. But one advantage of those kinds of things is that it gets people's attention and it's interesting. And, you know, one of the challenges with covering human rights stories, and when I was a journalist, it was incredibly frustrating, was I think this story is really important, it's really hard to sell, right? Like as a freelancer, or if you're writing for a publication, like those are downer stories, they're not fun, they're not catchy, you can't do them really fast, people's attention spans are really short. Apparently they're now shorter than a goldfish. 8 seconds is the average human attention span. So, like, it's a really hard sell, and the more you can make them interesting, whether it's because of some new technology, some new way of seeing it, some new way of, you know, visualizing it, or something that calls people's attention, and I think maybe the better. Maybe it's one way of calling attention to these kinds of stories that are otherwise really difficult. And the other thing I was thinking is just that empathy, I think, is totally key with human rights stories. I mean, I heard last night we had this awards dinner, and we gave an award to a Yazidi couple who have spent the last several years basically saving women who've been captured by ISIS and forced into being sex slaves. And their story was so harrowing, but so amazing. And, you know, one of them spoke some English, very broken, the other one didn't speak any English, and we needed a translator. Not many people have heard their story, and it takes some time for them to tell the story about how they do this, how they set this up, how they develop these networks of people, how they develop connections with these girls who've been captured. It can't be done in like a short soundbite. So I feel like there needs to be ways of creating space for those sort of stories that require more time and focus to create empathy. Do you know what I mean? Like, and that's different than a new technology, like a new visual technology, but it's almost like ways of getting people away from their cell phones, away from all the things that are otherwise distracting them, to really focus on this person's story, or this firm's story, or this couple's story, because, you know, kind of like documentary film used to do, but it's very hard to do, and it's very hard to find those. So kind of places that turn off all those distractions temporarily.
Well, I think, I might say that the distractions, the means of those distractions, the cell phone or the ability, because to tell a complicated, complex story when you have 3 column inches is hard to do. It's almost impossible. But when you move it to an online medium, you have limitless, column inches. The question is, like you said, attention span. So if you find stories that are compelling enough and you are able to activate networks to spread those stories,
And
it's
maybe
possible.
using technology to make them more interesting or practical.
Yeah, I think we're increasingly a visual culture, increasingly a platform-driven culture. Unless you have images, and pictures have always been more than words in many, many ways, and especially dramatic pictures. But it's becoming increasing that we know from even things like Twitter feed, if you have a picture attached to it, it gets some exponential more amount of attention than just something in words. But it's the nature of the media piece. Increasingly, as you said, the attention span is shorter, and most, especially our short form media, if you can go to a documentary or an endless New Yorker piece, you have a different way of explaining things, but most short form journalism does not explain, it just describes. And it is mostly post facto, and it's looking at an event, and it's almost impossible to include a process in that. So to build empathy, it's not going to be through a long story or a complex story. It's going to have to be a fairly strong and perhaps shocking image that grabs people's attention right away. And then maybe they're willing to dive a little bit deeper into it. But it's also the nature of the short form journalism, which is what most of us consume day to day.
I mean, I think to tack on to that, I think, obviously I completely agree about the role that empathy does play and has to play and should play. But I think there's also like a next step as well, for lack of a better word, I would describe as relevance, which is to say, like, it's one thing to have, like a heartbreaking photo of a Syrian child on an ambulance that everybody's sort of shocked and horrified by. But then, the sort of common refrain after that is, right, but like, what can I do? But I can't end the war in Syria, so like, what is it that I am going to do about this? And I think, one of the things that I think is characteristic of really successful human rights campaigns or sort of movements to get action on a given issue tend to be when you can make it relevant to someone's life in an immediate way. And so, press freedom is important because journalists should be allowed to do their job without fear of dying for doing it. But a step further than that, is to say, look, press freedom is important because your national security is actually better when journalists can tell their stories. Ebola spreads less quickly when journalists have the ability to report accurately and quickly. And so it's not just, feel-good issue because we should all have this sort of moral calling to make sure that this happens, but in fact, it's better for your health, it's better for the environment, it's better for, security, it's better for women's rights, it's better for education, it's better, whatever it is. You don't have to think press freedom is important because you're a touchy-feely person who likes journalists. I don't always like journalists. My job to protect them, No, I'm kidding, they're all delightful. But I do think, at some point it's sort of saying, like, take it that step further, you should, I think one of the things that's very interesting to me is the difference between, like, when we talk about, refugees and welcoming refugees into one's own country. Obviously, Canada is very different than the US, but one of the things that I thought was very interesting in Canada was that there were those huge fires in Fort McMurray, and much of the coverage after that was talking about the role that refugees played in organizing emergency response for Canadian families. And that to me is many of those stories I know were being pitched by human rights organizations. They're like, tell that story. That story will make people like refugees. That story will make people want to welcome them. And I think that, it was a factual story. It wasn't, those things were true and they were happening, but it was sort of a way of saying, like, this is one example of why it's good to have, more people here. Here's an example of, why these things are relevant to, like, you, Susan, who lives in Ohio, should care about this thing. not just because it's sort of this great, horrible thing that exists in the world, but rather because there's a tangible connection to the life you lead, to the life your children lead, to, you know, the world that you exist in. And I think that often in service of sort of great evocative rhetoric about like the horrible nature of these abuses and the grand scale of them, that it's really overwhelming for an average person to understand, you know, kind of how that affects their life. You know, it's one thing to read a 3,000 word piece on rape camps, you know, against ECD women. It's another thing to say, okay, but now what do I do with that information? And I think journalists are actually really uniquely in a position to make things relevant to people in a way that, you know, if you've already Googled CBJ and gone to our website, like half my job is done. You know, you're already there. But I think journalists have a level of access that other people don't, and I think that that's a real privilege and real power that they have.
Okay, so I really would like to open the floor to questions, because you guys have been great. So.
I just want to comment on that, because I was thinking in terms of linking with the Innocence Project and how wrongful convictions are, and especially on for Kingsborough on that road. For the most part, of the shortage of, you know, due to racial discrimination and things of that nature, it opens the floor, you know, for us to mention in the U.S. to talk about, well, you know, a lot of people don't know that death penalty is internationally recognized as a human rights violation. But once you start saying that, there are a lot or a great number of people who've been wrongfully convicted and then the project for those where the convictions are overturned, and then journalists use those news stories to say, well, you know, in fact that somebody who spent 30 years in death row, 30 years of their life, you know, in jail wrongfully, and then use that as a platform to advocate that, you know, it's actually, you know, the death penalty is a violation of human rights and bring human rights into that perspective.
If I could say one thing in response to that, and this goes to what you're saying about making it relevant to people, is I think that's a really powerful argument. I've always thought the innocence argument is the most powerful argument against the death penalty. But I remember talking to someone who was very involved in abolishing the death penalty in New Jersey, and apparently the way that worked was they were able to convince the legislature to abolish it because it was expensive. It costs too much to let people have all these appeals, and that's what convinced people, like, I don't want to spend all that money on someone who's a murderer, and like that. And so it's amazing, kind of very self-serving in a way thing. Taxpayers are like, I don't want to spend my money just on, you know, living a life in jail.
Yeah, the majority of people don't know that, you know, so put somebody on death row and then, you know, to use the death penalty is more expensive.
Right.
Life in prison.
Right.
This is, I suppose, this might be more directed to the advocate from the CBJ, but it's open as well to you. So as we said, a lot of people have phones now. I have just gotten a Twitter account where you did not have one.
I'm sorry.
Still,
Your life will never be the same. Well, no.
But I started to follow the Syria campaign, different actual individuals in Syria taking videos of you know, Russian airstrikes, conditions in Syria, and so there's already a ready-made population of, you know, like we could call them journalists. They are people taking information that can be told to other people. And since the dialogue around Syria seems to be that, well, the airstrikes happen, but it is horrible, but it eventually will give way to stability or something along those lines. These people in Syria don't seem to answer. You can ask the question, why isn't there an equal amount of airstrikes in Morocco, where there is more activity? Why doesn't the regime target, you know, jihadists more so than often? Plenty of questions to be raised, but how do, and I suppose this might relate to protecting journalists, but where is the line between promoting journalists and protecting them? Or can we do both at the same time, or should we?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question. I think I sort of alluded to this a little bit before by saying like we're really flexible about how we define someone as a journalist. I think, you a big part of, so CPJ does a number of things. One is that it's very focused on sort of press freedom advocacy and working towards a world where, press freedom is a sort of respected norm everywhere from North Dakota to, North Korea. Now, I'm not same way like that. And I think realistically speaking, the tactics you're going to use in North Korea or to try and achieve that end in North Korea are going to look very different than what you're trying to achieve in North Dakota. I think we put out a snarky, I shouldn't say snarky, but we put out a statement, when Amy Goodman was charged that was like maybe a little sassier than we would have put out somewhere else, where we just said like, really, the officials in North Carolina should probably be embarrassed about this. And sort of like just being like, this is ridiculous, that would not be necessarily the approach in another place. So part of it, in terms of figuring out like where we're going to be promoting press freedom and actively sort of focused on that piece of it, as opposed to emergency response, as opposed to quite literal protection work, varies so much context, based on context. So, one of the challenges we've had CPJ does, there are 2 big data sets that we collect and release every year. One is we do a kill list of every journalist who has been killed as a direct result of their work, for their work. And we do a list of all of the journalists who are imprisoned for their work. And because that revolving door is incredibly difficult to quantify, we do it as a snapshot. So every journalist who's in jail on December 1st of that year. One of the challenges that has come up for us recently has been in Turkey, where, in this sort of post-coup mania, we'll call it, our prison list is usually about 200 people, and I think right now, including cases that we've not yet had a chance to vet, so we don't know necessarily that they will be on our list, but I know we have over 160 in Turkey alone, right, or have at one point had as many as 160, that, many of them may not turn out to be cases for us. They might be, have been arrested for something else, or, may in fact be out by then, but, really, the focus right now in Turkey is to sort of address this immediate urgent situation, rather than saying like, right, let's sort of sit down and talk about how we can like improve press freedom 10 years out. Like, we're really focused on improving press freedom or protection of journalists there today. We had a case of a journalist who was being taken to court for, to face charges for his work, who was shot at outside of the courtroom. I mean, you're dealing with a whole different level than, sort of a journalist who gets slapped with some ridiculous charges in North Dakota, who then sort of gets to like be interviewed and quite loudly, raise her voice about how insane this is. And so I think one of the things to sort of, I don't know if this is really answering your question, but in terms of figuring out like where we are hyping the role of journalists, or where we are having this discussion about the role of press freedom as being central to security, to public health, to education, gender equality, whatever, that conversation is often sort of secondary or happening simultaneously with discussions about how do we protect people in sort of the immediate, and that's, it's often a life or death matter for people that we're dealing with. That's the reality of it, is that journalism, I'm not a journalist, but I really do, my jokes aside, respect and admire, the work that these people do. It shouldn't be a job that comes with a death sentence, and far too frequently it does. So I think the answer is that it's a case-by-case basis on the country and sort of where we can have impact and how that impact can be achieved.
And if I could just say one more thing, I mean, it's interesting, it depends on the role you're playing. So, people who are journalists and would be completely legit, should be protected as human rights organization. You might not want to rely on their work. You might not think it's reliable, or you might not think it's, one of the issues that's been very hard to document has to do with drone strikes in Yemen, in Pakistan, in various places where human rights researchers have had trouble getting access. And there are a handful of local people who will sometimes document them or interview people, and they'll bring that information to human rights researchers and say, like, this is what's going on. And they're certainly local journalists, and they're deserving of protection. But as a human rights group, it's often really hard to know who you can trust, because even those people might have their own agenda, or they might be reporting some piece of the story and not another piece of the story. And so it's really hard to see, huge variance in numbers of quote-unquote civilians killed, or militants, or, people define them differently in U.S. drone strikes because the reporting is so hard to verify. So it's like how you deal with a journalist depends on what your purpose is.
And there's just one second, I'll just introduce something that I'm all for just getting rid of the term citizen journalists. Just getting rid of it. And I would argue there are citizen reporters. And if we use the term citizen reporters, we'd be able to get away from a lot of discussion about what is a journalist and what is not a journalist. Because I can report to you, but you were looking out the window, I was looking, and I saw the Martians coming. And I'm going to upload a photograph. You all listening over here, but the Martians did come and land over there, and I'm going to report that. It's going to be all over, and they took Donald Trump away. I'm a citizen. I'm a citizen reporter reporting that. Now, does that make me a journalist? And what is the level of what we want to call journalism? There is no accepted definition of journalism, no licensing of journalism in the United States. But there are some accepted standards of what I would argue is fairness, fullness, accuracy in reporting. And if we want to define what good journalists, well, we lose a lot of people that we call journalists here in the United States. We're not qualified for that. But if we can redefine a lot of what is coming out of different places as citizen reporting instead of citizen journalism, we can escape some of those quandaries arguing with that. So it's just a level soapbox for me.
And I would add to that. I mean, the boundaries are just so blurred now in a way that they just weren't. 10 or 5 or even 2 years ago. Now, so much news and journalism is just centered around the phone, and much of the material that you're seeing, which could be photos or video, that's all generated by, I guess, people who would be traditionally referred to as citizen journalists. We would refer to it as user-generated content. Kind of an awkward name, but and then much of that material has to be vetted as well, and just said, checking the people who shot this footage and verifying that they are who they say they are. And as Daphne was suggesting, these could be people with a certain agenda, and the material needs to be just scrutinized.
And maybe, Trenton, you can say a few words on this, because I'm very interested in the technologies that are being used now by some groups to embed GPS type location, encrypted GPS location, and these sort of things that with people you're working with to make sure it's coming from the places we're saying it is.
Yeah.
Some of those technologies, I think, are one way to have much better verification of citizen reporting and verification, make the verification process much more reliable.
Right. As well as and obtaining that information without any outside scrutiny or encryption.
Well, also safeguarding safety or being aware of the situations. Because when you have GPS information, you can verify your source, but if that information is available to people who might not like your source.
For sure. No, absolutely. Look, we have to go out of our way routinely to figure out the best way to get information from people who reach out for assistance. If somebody says, hi, I'm, in country X and I need to get out, I'm getting death threats from the local government and I think they're going to come after me and my family, then, the first sort of line of questioning involves figuring out what is the safest way for us to communicate with these people. And it is, should they really be emailing me? Should we be talking on the phone? Should we not? If we're going to be, using frequently, so, before taking on this advocacy role, I was working covering sub-Saharan Africa. And so we found that overwhelmingly instant messaging is just the easiest way to get in touch with people. And so I, would be using WhatsApp or Signal to get in touch with people because they both have end-to-end encryption. But, that's also, in equal measure, what we see is a real effort by a lot of governments to make those tools illegal. We had a journalist in Ethiopia who was arrested for going to an encryption training. It was like going to learn how to use encrypted email and was arrested for it because, it's the line of reasoning being that if you have something that you're trying to hide, then it's probably something we don't want you doing. I think as a side note, much though I would love to live in a world where I get to set the standards for journalism, it's interesting to hear this sort of discussion about, whether, how we sort of qualify someone or quantify, the citizen reporter thing. I'm fully on board and, signing up for that campaign. But I do think, the hardest part of this job, at least initially for me, was recognizing that I have to defend a lot of people who say a lot of things I don't like. That it's in some ways press freedom is a very interesting, sort of right to be working on, insofar as, I spend a lot of time defending people that I would actually, I don't really want you to be allowed to say that out loud about women, or that sort of thing. But the only way that I can ensure that someone I do like can then write a scathing response is by making sure that both of them are protected to do so. And then sort of putting my faith in, journalists or journalistic institutions to try and sort of do better or produce something better. And one of the neat sort of impacts of the proliferation of these tools is that you can also engage with people. I think Rukmini Kalamaki did a huge, she's a journalist in the New York Times, did a big piece on rape as a strategy being used by ISIS, and then hopped on Twitter and spent 3 hours just answering questions from readers saying why did you cover this, or why didn't you cover that, or what happened to this person. And I do think that that's an interesting side effect too, is I think your question earlier about can you hold journalists to account for the stories they don't tell, and I agree, completely with the answers that were given to that, but I also think there's space for you to sort of tweet out or email or reach out and say, I'm just curious why this didn't get more coverage. And as a person, as a citizen, as a human being, that's a question you also have the space to ask. Or write an op-ed, sort of saying why you think it should have been covered more. That, and that sort of space for us is that we just protect your, or try to protect your right to use the tools of journalism without fear of reprisal or repercussion.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question.
I'm doing ICJ and I'm learning about all these global institutions that are all these global institutions that are helping bring countries together and giving them accountability for what they do, such as the ICC and the UN and Interpol and other stuff. So I wonder if there isn't are journalists and people that what was the name of your?
Communities Protect Journalists.
Yeah, if they're looking into trying to do a global, a global protection of journalists, where countries sign, agree and sign on rights that journalists should have in those countries, and if anything, then people could go in and help them get out. So then journalists could go into a country feeling safer or knowing how they're going to be treated. I'm guessing if there's this body of governments that sign saying oh yeah, I'm gonna give these journalists, I'm in the global scale, I'm giving these journalists X amount of freedom. They're able to do this and that. Then wouldn't that give journalists a better sense of a better sense of you know what, I'm gonna go into this country because I already know in this country I'm gonna get the same rights as I had let's say in my country or anything else.
I will try my very best to not be too long-winded in my answer to this. I think it's a really interesting question. I think there are a couple of things at play. The first is that, reaching a point where a bunch of different countries with different standards reach an agreement about what rights journalists should have would almost certainly end up rolling back a lot of rights that we think journalists should have. And so in terms of sort of efforts on an international level, a lot of what you see are things like, another press freedom group called Reporters Without Borders has been pushing for a special rapporteur at the United Nations whose job would be to look at journalist safety and protection of journalists. One of the things that we've been very active on, rather than going through, UN bodies, we do a lot of work with UN bodies. There's a lot of interest there, as you can imagine. It's often a self-selecting couple of countries that decide to engage on those issues. One of the things that we've done a lot of work on is looking at freelancers who obviously face a great number of issues, particularly covering conflict, is working to sort of push. We have a group called the ACOS Alliance, which is a culture of safety, which urges media organizations or media groups to ensure that they are treating and paying and supporting their freelancers in the way that they would their regular staff. Because often what we were seeing is, young freelancers buying a plane ticket to, Mosul, and then ending up, in a situation where they can't afford translators, or they can't afford insurance, or they can't afford a satellite phone, or they, and the precautions that they need to take to keep themselves as safe as one can be in a war zone. They're, instead are finding themselves just going without because, well, this is how the last generation of conflict reporters cut their teeth, was by going and telling the stories, so we'll do the same. And if they're not making enough money to do it safely, then there's a real sort of question there. And so, there's sort of that piece. But the last sort of roundabout answer to your question, I think, is that the bigger challenge isn't for, making sure that Trenton can be safe when he flies to cover a story in Angola. The bigger issue is that there are 72 journalists in Angola for every one Western reporter who are going to get it worse, and who it doesn't matter if there's an international standard if the government of Angola doesn't want to respect their own press. Ultimately, overwhelmingly, the cases we deal with are people facing oppression in their own countries. And it's very difficult to enforce that. It's also very difficult to fact check that, as was already said. We had, for instance, there's been, I'd say in the last 18 months, a lot of sub-Saharan African governments have adopted this fun new practice of just shutting down the internet when they don't want things to be reported on. And so it sort of more or less wasn't happening at all, save for around the Arab Spring. And then within the last about just under 2 years, I think it's happened now 31 internet shutdowns in 12 countries, I believe. And sometimes shutting down, cell phone towers as well, which means, if you shut down access to the internet, access to your cell phone the day before an election, the day of an election, the day after an election, can we imagine what Donald Trump would do with that kind of power? Realistically, you're having an impact that's far greater than just impeding press freedom. People can't, communicate with one another, and you can't necessarily call a hospital. You can't sort of do any of those things. And those challenges, while we can sort of try to rally international support and international pressure, at the end of the day, it's very difficult to say that because the UN or some international body or the ICC has sort of achieved an agreement that we should abide by these standards, doesn't necessarily mean the countries will. And in fact, many of the countries who are committing these kinds of abuses are countries that are, sort of party to international agreements to respect those things. They are countries that have press freedom written into their constitutions. They are countries that sort of hold those standards. But to a point that was made early on, forgive me for being to sound like such a Debbie Downer. I, love international institutions as a thing, but I do think there's a point where we sort of say, look, you're living in a country that has made it pretty clear they don't care about international law in a meaningful way. So, what makes us think that the dictator in Gambia is, necessarily going to care either?
My response to that would be no, we don't want that. We don't want that kind of
little shorter.
Because that leads to defining a journalist, licensing a journalist, and saying that people then who are not journalists don't have those rights. And it's a very, very dangerous and slippery slope we're on then. And journalists' rights are violated in countries where almost always many, many other human rights are being violated. And journalists certainly should have more access. And that's something that should always be worked on. But I don't know why journalists should have any more rights than any other citizen.
I could just add, I just want to emphasize the point that some of these rights are included in international human rights treaties, and they're just not respected. And so that's, the countries will claim, Sudan is a signatory to lots of human rights treaties, and that doesn't.
In fact, some of the greatest violators of human rights have a very good ratification record.
Yeah. And so some people claim that human rights treaties are useless for that reason. I don't.
And in fact, the counter argument of the United States always is, why do you get so upset that Bangladesh not having ratified so many? You still have a much better human rights record than some routine human rights violators that have signed and ratified. So,
Yeah. And I don't mean to say that these are useless, because I don't think they are, and I think over time there's a trend in which it creates certain norms and it becomes more difficult but it's a very slow process, and I'm sure you'll learn, you know, as you learn more about the international system, it's so hard to get things done because, you know, the UN has all of these different member nations, and when they have to agree on something, and to enforce it, there's no sort of overarching enforceability. So, and even with the ICC, I mean, the United States isn't even a member. So it's really important to have those institutions, and they set norms, and over time they change kind of the expectations of the law, but it's very, very much enforced.
So I think I'm sorry that I have to cut this, but we are out of time. We can continue conversations. We have some refreshments. But I would really like to thank again our wonderful, excellent panelists for volunteering their time to spend this evening with us. This was so great. Thank you so much.